Hey everyone, happy Super Bowl week. This is Anthony Cosenza with the Orange and Black Insider Bengals podcast. I hope you are all doing well. We had a week off. Some of us were under the weather, and given that this is a little bit of a slower time of the year for the Cincinnati Bengals, they're not in the postseason, and shocker, news alert, they're not in the Super Bowl. We're going to try and still do the program every week. There may be a couple of times where we take a week off here and there during January. Well, January is almost done now, and maybe February, but March, April will be full go, and obviously through training camp and all of that will be full go as well. Again, we're gonna still try and make this a weekly thing for the time being, just even in this slow period. But in case we miss a week or two, give us a little slack if you would. That would be appreciated. Appreciate it. Again, it's Anthony Cosenza with the Orange and Black Insider Bengals podcast. I'll be joined shortly by my co-host, Scott Schultze. I hope you have all been well. You can get this program if you are new to the show, and there have been a bunch of new subscribers to our YouTube channel, which is awesome. A lot of different downloads we've seen from listeners through iTunes, SoundCloud, YouTube. Our stuff's on Cincy Jungle, so you can get it there to make it easy on yourself. So we appreciate all of the support, and you can get all of our stuff on those platforms. We're also reachable via Twitter at BengalsOBI and via email, theobinsider@gmail.com. We appreciate all of the feedback. Just to get started, a little bit of news and notes going forward, and then we've got a lot on tap tonight since we took last week off. Mike Brown has made a number of different comments, and they are very Mike Brown-esque, if you know anything about the old Bengals owner. We'll kind of dive into that a little bit and examine what he was recently saying about the Cincinnati Bengals and Marvin Lewis coming back, all that good stuff. We're going to take a look at Jeremy Hill in light of a recent tweet he sent out that was very interesting. And we're going to continue our conversation on how to improve the Cincinnati Bengals in 2018 during this offseason. We've been doing that over the past month or two now, have a handful of different options that we've laid out for the team to be able to become a better and an improved team over in this offseason, which is very critical after two straight losing seasons. And if you have some listener questions, we'll be scanning the YouTube chat as well as our Twitter account at BengalsOBI and on Cincy Jungle in the comment thread. We'll be checking that out for different comments and questions. We appreciate it. Just a couple of things. Obviously, the Pro Bowl would commence this week. A lot of people are kind of about that. Geno Atkins and Clark Harris were part of the festivities, and for those who didn't, just a fun little tidbit. Clark Harris in practice set the Guinness Book of World Records world record for the longest snap, the longest long snap by a football snapper. So kind of funny, and congratulations to Mr. Harris. Pretty cool, and he did it during his first ever Pro Bowl berth, and a well-deserved berth, especially given how his career has gone with the Cincinnati Bengals. He's been a very steady presence since he joined the club in 2009, and kudos to him for making the Pro Bowl, and little icing on the cake, I guess, for setting a Guinness Book of World Records for the longest snap. Kind of cool there. If there was anything that could steal the spotlight from President Donald Trump and his State of the Union address on Tuesday evening, it would be a blockbuster trade in the NFL. And though the trade of Alex Smith from the Chiefs to the Washington Redskins doesn't necessarily have to do much with the Cincinnati Bengals, there's a couple of connections we can make here. Obviously, Jay Gruden, the head coach of the Washington Redskins, former Bengals offensive coordinator, and he not only had a quarterback that is very similar, maybe even a little better than the Bengals signal caller in Kirk Cousins the past couple of years. He now has yet another kind of guy in that same mold, game manager, little bit of a dink and dunk type of player in Alex Smith. they dealt Alex Smith, the quarterback, the Chiefs did, to Washington for a third-round pick and cornerback Kendall Fuller. Now, this is very interesting for a number of reasons. Number one, it makes you wonder what Kirk Cousins was asking of the Redskins in terms of a financial number for a contract. So that's one thing. And now, by all indications, the Redskins are moving on from Kirk Cousins, and he will now be free to, after having signed the franchise tag for 2 years in a row, he will now be able to peruse the open free agent market, and there are probably a number of teams that will be clamoring for his services. The Denver Broncos will be one. I would imagine that the Cleveland Browns would be another. The Cleveland Browns do hold the number 1 overall pick in the draft, so they might go with the youth movement at quarterback. They did spend a high second-round pick on Deshaun Kaiser last year. He didn't show much in his rookie year, but he's a very young guy. Who knows if they stick with him? I don't know exactly what's going to play out here, but pretty interesting stuff. I believe now I am joined by my co-host, Scott Schultze. Scott, I'm going through some news and notes and around the league and with the Bengals, and you probably heard me talking about Kirk Cousins. Obviously, a bit of a shock that Alex Smith was – not that Alex Smith was traded, because there's been a lot of rumors of that, but that Alex Smith was traded to the Redskins. That was kind of a shock, was it not?
Yeah, I think one thing this definitely does is makes, I think, Bengals fans, hopefully gives you a chance to kind of realize what we have in Dalton. That granted, I think me and you would be the first ones to complain when he has a bad game, when he has 4 or 5 interceptions. He's had some bad games. It's not, he's obviously not Peyton Manning. He's not John Elway. He's not Joe Montana. But when you look at what the Redskins just gave up to basically get Andy Dalton, a game manager, a guy doesn't have a ton of turnovers, a guy who's solid, can hand the ball off, can throw it on occasion when you need to. They just gave up, their top best young defensive player and a third-round pick. That'd be like the Bengals giving up, William Jackson III and, a third-round pick to get Andy Dalton. And as much as we want to complain about him, we definitely want to give up William Jackson III and a mid-round pick to get him. So it's on one hand, when you see it, it kind of makes you feel lucky that, okay, yeah, we don't have the world's greatest quarterback, but at least we have one solid enough that teams are, giving up these, and all the money they're giving, something like $70 million for 4 years or something. So, all the money in the, your best young defensive player and a pick for a guy that we haven't kind of complained about because he's not great. So it just kind of makes you feel that, yeah, we are in a bad situation. We're not in a great situation, but it could be a lot worse. And it kind of shows what happens when you get desperate at quarterback. And you mentioned the Browns, and obviously they seem to draft one every couple of years, and probably they're going to be doing that again this year, unless they pay, Kirk Cousins, 25, 30, whatever he's going to be asking. So yeah, that was kind of my biggest takeaway, was just the sense of, yeah, we don't have something great, but on the other hand, it's kind of like your car. If you have like a car that gets you to work and back or whatever, it may not be the greatest car. It's, 10 years old, the check engine lights on, whatever, but it works. It gets you there. It's not, doesn't have fumes, doesn't catch on fire. It's not in the shop. So it's one of those things where it's not, sometimes, yeah, it's not the fancy, I don't know, BMW, whatever it's obviously not a Lamborghini, but at the same point, it's my nice stable Honda Accord that manages to get me there. So yeah, I was just, man, if you can get that much for him, I kind of wonder what we could get for Dalton if we decide to keep McCarron or vice versa. Yeah.
You mentioned the contract. It was pretty surprising. I believe it was $71 million guaranteed over 4 years, and I think the entire contract could be worth up to $94 million or so. So pretty staggering numbers for a guy. Yes, he took a team to an NFC championship. Yes, he's won playoff games with the Kansas City Chiefs, but still viewed as a guy who is a game manager, a guy who does not take a lot of chances. And interesting statistic, I was talking to a friend of mine last night, and there's a podcast out. Yes, there are other podcasts out besides this one, by the way, folks. If you decide to listen to anything else besides us, which we won't blame you, but keep listening to us. At any rate, there's another podcast out with a couple of PFF folks that, talk about their metrics and all of that. And yes, a lot of us have some qualms with PFF, and I think we all agree what they do is great, but I don't think it needs to be the end all be all when it comes to analyzing every single NFL player. But obviously a lot of merit to what they do. However, what they came up with was a metric of quarterbacks in the NFL who make quote unquote NFL type throws. Now, obviously that's kind of a different kind of metric, and there's a little bit of a gray area there, but they came up with the fact that Alex Smith threw about 65% to 70% of the throws he made in 2017 are not considered NFL type throws. And we're talking, those shallow crosses, bubble screens, dump off passes, those sort of things that really any quarterback at the NFL level can make. We're talking, the NFL throws, quote unquote, are, the out routes thrown from the opposite hash, the deep balls, that sort of thing. And that's not Alex Smith's forte. He takes care of the football. He wins games. He has yet to win a Super Bowl, but we'll see if that now it can be done. If he's 33 years old now, I believe, and he now is joining the Washington Redskins as their quarterback, and it's going to be very interesting to see where Kirk Cousins lands at, and if Cousins can replicate the success he has had in recent years with the Redskins. So those are kind of some news and notes going around the league. We've got some more Bengals news and notes we're going to get to and examine throughout the show, and we want to hear from you. So get at us in the YouTube chat with other Bengals fans, or in the comment thread at Cincy Jungle, or you can get at us via Twitter at BengalsOBI. Scott, it's been about a week and a half to 2 weeks now since this occurred, but Mike Brown, in one of the very rare occasions, spoke openly and on a couple of different occasions, spoke with members of the Cincinnati media. He had a separate interview with Bengals.com editor Jeff Hobson. He had a sit-down with Jim Owczarski of the Cincinnati Enquirer. And kudos to especially Jim Owczarski of the Cincinnati Enquirer, who didn't lob softball questions to Mike Brown. He he didn't go after him, but he asked some pointed questions. And in typical Mike Brown fashion, he kind of chased his tail in answering some of these questions. And he answered them in ways that were a bit frustrating. Now, I want to get your takeaways. I hope you've had a chance to at least read some of the transcripted interview that Mike Brown had with the Cincinnati media. I found it to personally be a little bit uninspiring, especially in an offseason where we were, as Bengals fans and those who follow the team, were sort of promised change of some kind, and really the only change we received was a defensive coordinator change and some assistant coaching changes. Just your overall, I'm going to go in to some of Mike Brown's specific quotes and ask you about those, but just your overall impression of what Mike Brown had to say in terms of tying a bow on the 2017 season, his decisions that he has made in 2018, and do you believe that there are going to be changes this year or no?
I think yes and no. I think we're going to have changes the way Mike Brown sees changes, which is not the way a regular human, I think, sees changes. I mean, in theory, like if I sit right here and I shift over like 2 inches, we can be like, hey, we changed our podcast. And yeah, we
theoretically, right?
Yeah, but that's kind of like your Mike Brown change. Like, yeah, we're going to spend in free agency. So instead of waiting till the third week and grabbing a guy for like $1 million per season, we'll get a guy in that second week and spend $2 million per season on instead of AJ Hawk, we'll get like the next guy up. So, and you mentioned the coaches, like, yeah, you get the assistant coaches. That's great. I mean, I think everyone was excited to see, well, maybe not Paul Alexander or his family, but I think the fans were excited to see some change with that. I think the fans were kind of mixed on Gunther, probably more excited because it was something different. But yeah, you still have the same problem at top. You still have that guy that can't get his team up for big games and doesn't seem to run the clock well. And so you have this incremental stuff, but how many years can you do this incremental dink and dunk thing until you just can't until you just say enough's enough. We have to make, a bigger step. And I think part of it, and there was I think I did a post on this a few weeks ago. I think part of the reason is, this is my personal opinion, so I could be wrong. I think it's Mike Brown's age, because if you look at Mike Brown's family, he was one of 3 boys. The oldest one, I think, died in his upper 40s, early 50s, a couple decades ago. The youngest boy, Mike's in the middle. The youngest one, I think, died just back in December, somewhat unexpectedly. So now you have Mike, who's left. He's, getting up there in age. I think he's 70s or 80s. So, I think he's the same age his dad was when his dad died. So he's outlived his 2 brothers. So he might be saying, hey, I don't know how much more time, God's given me on this earth. I maybe tomorrow, it may be 20 years. And I think when you see that, you tend to be a little, the last thing he probably wants to do is hit the reset button and start all over. Because I think he does want to see a championship. Whether he wants to do everything you have to do to commit to get one, I don't know. But I think deep down, he'd like to have one. He'd like to see, to see his dad's team get that championship they've never gotten. And I think in his mind, it's probably the best chance of doing that in his lifetime is probably, his mind is probably not to start over, have some sort of rebuild for a few years and get some new players and new coaches, start from scratch. But hey, let's keep what we have. We've had some decent years. Let's tweak it, let's make a little, adjust here and there and see if that can get us there while I'm still alive to enjoy this thing. So to me, and I know it wasn't in the interview, but that's kind of my personal take, is I think just based on the age and where he's at, I think that we probably are never going to see the big changes fans want until, Katie Blackburn is either running the team, or, someone sold it and it's in a new ownership.
You are probably correct. And I love the comment made in the YouTube chat by Sean Slaughter. So they just sprayed a bottle of perfume on a bag of garbage. It was what he wrote there. I thought that was pretty clever, and maybe a little over the top. But I mean, the Bengals haven't been necessarily a bag of garbage lately. But I mean, I think big picture, obviously they have not been successful. They have not won an NFL championship, and this is stuff that dates back pre-Mike Brown, and unfortunately, he is doing a lot of things his father did in the negative way. He is showing the loyalty that his father showed to certain personnel members, and it's for better or for worse. There's good and bad to that trait, and unfortunately, that's kind of showing up. I thought this was interesting. Jim Ozarski asked Mike Brown about basically why Marvin Lewis was chosen to be retained for 2 more years, especially following the 3-game losing streak to Pittsburgh, Chicago, and Minnesota. Obviously, those 3 games were devastating, especially the Pittsburgh game, because the Bengals had such a big lead in prime time, and that could have been a season changer. They collapsed in that game, particularly in the second half, as you noted, is an issue with Marvin Lewis, Scott. And then they got blown out by a bad Chicago team at home, and then blown out in Minnesota by a good Vikings team. Basically, Jim Ozarski also expanded on that, saying basically the 2-game win streak at the end of the season against 2 teams that were vying to get into the postseason, that had something to do with Lewis coming back. Essentially, he said, yes, we had a very unusual season. Yeah, obviously, we were off offensively. We lost a handful of games that were games we should have won. They were close. They were one-play games. And if we had managed to win our share of those, we would be in that middle group of teams. In my mind, there's a middle group that runs from, say, 6-10 to 9-7. That's over a dozen teams. With all of them, they have a fan base that is dissatisfied. Ours is no exception. It kind of goes on and on. Does that show to you an owner that is out of touch? Because, again, he's referencing the fact that the Bengals could have been a middle-of-the-pack team and may have been able to sneak into the postseason. It's almost as if, and this, unfortunately for Mike Brown, he does not get the benefit of the doubt with what he says because the Bengals have not been a successful franchise. And we love to pick nits when it comes to Mike Brown quotes, but I look at that and it's almost like he's okay. In my mind, there's a middle group that runs from, say, 6-10 to 9-7. That's over a dozen teams. With all of them, they have a fan base that is dissatisfied. Ours is no exception. And yet they are all close to having been in that next level. Well, that next level is getting into the postseason. And yes, that's a goal, but I don't know. I feel like for a long time, I've always felt that the stigma against Mike Brown of, hey, being in the postseason is just good enough. I thought that was unfair. I do think he wants to win a Super Bowl. I do think he wants his team to be successful. He just can't get out of his own way. But a quote like that really just sticks in your craw, doesn't it? I mean, it kind of just is like, mediocrity is okay, and we were a step away from mediocrity.
Yeah, and it kind of makes you wonder. I think one challenge too is you look at the NFL, and if you watch enough games, you see that for the most part, outside of the Browns, obviously, because they're in their own world, and outside of the Patriots, most teams any given year are good enough to win probably anywhere between 5 to 10 games. Just, a bad call here, a phantom pass interference, a holding penalty, a fumble. Most teams are really close. You can look at any team any year. You can take 4 or 5 games they won. Like, man, we barely won that one. These things all had to work out right. And same way you can look at a few of their losses and say the same thing, that, man, a few losses we could have gone there. So for him to say that the Bengals, we were almost mediocre, a few things gone our way. And yeah, we could have been right there as one of those mediocre teams. It's like, yeah, that's nice. But, you were also really close a few of those games to almost losing them. I mean, the Lions game near the end, the Ravens game was like a 4-point game. The Buffalo Bills game was fairly close. Outside of the Browns game, every other game the Bengals played in this year, they could have potentially lost. You could have been a 10-win, 9-win team, but you also could have been a 2-win team. So for him to say, you can kind of paint a rosy picture and look at it one way, which is nice, but you can't then pretend the other extreme doesn't exist. That, we won 7 games, we could have won 9. Well, you could have won 2. So let's be a little realistic and not just say, well, because, if everything had gone our way and we had a perfect season, we could have had 9 or 10 wins for keeping our coach. That's absurd. If you have everything go your way and you could have had a perfect season, you should have won 15 or 16 games, not, 9 or 10, especially in a, parity-driven league that you need everything to go right just to be a, 500 decent team. The other thing that kind of worries me is just the, just that mindset that those last 2 games got Marvin his job back. Because if you look at what Marvin's done in his bad years, in 2008, 2010, horrible seasons, they were out of it early in the year. Both those years, they had like 2 or 3 wins going into the final month. Lined up to get a great draft pick. What did they do in 2008? They finish out 3-0 to get 4 wins. They had like 1 win. They're 1-11 or something, and then won 3 games. 2 years later, 2010, they did the same thing. They won 2 of the last 3 games, and it's just, on one hand, it's just frustrating as a fan because, hey, we're horrible. We're not getting anything. Let's at least get a high pick. And then they ruin that and screw that up. And then it's then you see not only does it screw up you getting a high pick, but then it keeps Marvin's job, and it just kind of feeds that whole story that Marvin can win when it doesn't matter. And,
well, yeah, and where was this the entire year, right?
Yeah. Why do we have to be totally out of it and have nothing to play for the team to finally respond and win a game? Yeah. Why can't we win a game when we're trying to get a playoff spot, not when we're trying to avoid getting a good pick?
Right. Yeah. All valid points. And I want to ask you about a couple more quotes here, and I don't want to beat a dead horse here, but like I said, I think this is very interesting stuff from the owner, who is obviously a lightning rod of a lot of different emotions from Bengals fans. And he's a guy that just doesn't speak publicly. And when he does, it's kind of eye-opening. Jim Ozarski, again, from the Cincinnati Enquirer, says it's Bill Belichick and Marvin Lewis in terms of the longest tenured head coach with one team. And when you haven't reached that, meaning a Super Bowl, let alone winning a playoff game, But even reaching the next step in the playoffs, in your mind, is 15 years enough of an opportunity to do that? Or do you look at what's ahead and what he can do for you in 2018 and 2019, which is the contract he signed? Brown says, I look forward as to who gives us the best chance next year. That's how I would address that question. Do I wish we had won the Super Bowl in each of the last 15 years? I do. Maybe it would have helped to have had Tom Brady. We didn't. I will credit Belichick with great success. In my mind, he is the top coach of his time in pro football, and that's all anybody can be. Okay. He has rung the gong, if you will. Oh, Mikey, and your metaphors. I love it. Good for him, and I admire him immensely, but he doesn't coach here. He's up in New England. And he's kind of saying how the Bengals are playing catch up to the Patriots and all of that. I don't know what to really make of that quote either, Scott. I mean, I get that he probably looks across, to Pittsburgh and sees continuity and how that team continues to be a competitive team, continues to win playoff games, Super Bowls, that sort of thing. And what's their secret? They've had, 2 coaches in the last 25 years, essentially. So, I mean, I get that, but he makes a statement. Maybe it would have helped to have had Tom Brady. We didn't. Well, that's okay. You didn't have Tom Brady, but you also didn't make a lot of moves in the draft to move up for players, to get another quarterback if you think you have another Tom Brady. You didn't make moves in free agency to help your football team. So though you don't have Tom Brady, you didn't do your part in a lot of different respects as well, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's easy to say they have a great coach, they have a great quarterback, we don't. Well, whose responsibility is that? I mean, it's ultimately his. Right. He's hiring the coach. If you don't think Marvin Lewis is Belichick, why aren't you bringing him in or getting the next guy in? If you're admitting that, yeah, they have a great coach, the greatest of our era, that means obviously the guy I have is not. So why are you sticking with the guy you have when clearly you're admitting he's not as good as the guy, as someone else could be? And then the thing with the quarterback, yeah, you aren't drafting or developing a Tom Brady. And again, that's on you because you aren't getting the coaches, the player personnel folks who are identifying and bringing that guy in. And as you mentioned, free agency, and Grant, you don't have a lot of great quarterbacks at free agency, but you have some. I mean, Drew Brees was a free agent when the Saints scooped him up. Peyton Manning, when the Colts, when he played his last game with the Colts, went to the Denver Broncos. You had a chance at getting those guys. You had Dalton and Palmer, but Dalton was still kind of young. I don't think anyone would have complained if the Bengals said, yeah, we have some decent guys, but look at who's out there. We're going after him. And you didn't. So yeah, you're not drafting the greatest quarterbacks. You're not signing them as free agents. You're not getting the great coaches. And I mean, it's almost like he's pointing a finger at someone else, but he's looking in a mirror, not realizing that it's you. I mean, at some point you kind of have to admit I'm the problem.
Yeah, and to me, it's almost a quote of, we have who we have, and we're making the best of it. I mean, it's kind of like, that's not good enough. I mean, I get comfortability. I get continuity and all of that, but it's kind of like, well, we didn't have Tom Brady. Well, you didn't really look to get Tom Brady. Well, we didn't have Bill Belichick. Well, you didn't really look to get Bill Belichick. You kind of like got who you've got, and you're making the best of it, and that's kind of what you're doing. And that's not good enough. That's just not good enough. The last thing I want to talk about before we move on, Scott, and before we tear our hair out based on what Mike Brown has said. Again, Jim Owczarski talks about free agency and the team potentially doing more. This is something that Marvin Lewis said in a press conference shortly after he signed his new contract with the team to remain through 2019. Marvin had said something to the effect of, we're going to maybe do a little bit more in free agency, and especially getting outside players who can help us, that sort of thing. Jim Owczarski asked Mike Brown about that. The one specific change Marvin mentioned was being better at finding players from other teams to augment the roster. Brown, quote, that's talked about a lot. It's the off-season focus for many. It's driven by the cap. We have that system that we have to adhere to, as does every other team in the league. Some of the teams that were especially successful last year in free agency, spoiler alert, check out everybody in the championship round to see what they did in free agency in 2016 and 2017. I think of Jacksonville. I think of the Rams. Were teams that had an inordinate amount of cap room. And they had been notably unsuccessful for years previous to this last season. They went out, and to their credit, they made costly acquisitions, but helpful acquisitions. They were in a position to do it. Most teams aren't. And we fall into the most teams aren't category. We try to spend our cap money in ways we think make sense. He kind of goes on and on. I have a problem with that, and there was somebody else in the chat room. I'm looking to see who it was. Essentially,
39 million.
Yes, yeah, the 39 million number in terms of cap space.
Christopher Higdon said that.
Christopher Higdon, that's who it was. Thank you very much. Yes, he wrote that, and I believe that to be a pretty accurate number. And the Bengals is a team that rolls over cap space quite frequently, that is unused, and they kind of just continue to roll it over because that's something that the new CBA allowed teams to do. I don't buy that they're a team that we're in the category of we can't spend money. I don't buy that. They've spent money in off seasons to extend certain players and in-house players. Mike Brown in another question noted that is the focus of this team, is to extend their own internal guys. But to me, that's not an accurate statement. So either he's lying or he doesn't know the figures and or how to manage the cap with his team. Which is it?
Yeah, I think what you said, you kind of hit it with the second point, that, I mean, all the teams are playing within the same rules. They, it's not like the Rams and the Jaguars have, special rules that apply to them that give them a lot more money. The Bengals have the same access to the same cap number everyone else does. So if they don't feel they're able to sign big, pricey free agents, then, that's on them and how they've structured their contracts and how they've set their roster up. And they can't sit here and say, woe is me, I can't sign anyone. We just have to play with these rules. They just don't work in our favor. There's nothing we can do. That's garbage. You can do the same thing everyone else does. You just have to you have to sign your players in a way that makes sense. You can't overpay for your own guys. You have, like they talked about recently about bringing Russell Bodine back. Why, if you're going to spend money on guys like that, then yeah, you can't go get good players because you're throwing it away. So you have the ability to. It's now, if we were talking baseball, if this is a baseball podcast, I totally get what he's saying, because you look, next door to the Bengals, you have the Cincinnati Reds, small market team. There's no salary cap, so most of the money in baseball is spent based on the local TV contracts. The Reds are a smaller market; they have a much smaller, income from the TV contracts. So yeah, in that situation, Castellini, whoever owns the Reds, they have an argument that Mike Brown's basically making the baseball argument, which doesn't make sense in football. Because in baseball, the Yankees and Dodgers, whoever, Cubs, they spend $200 million. We spend $60 million. So yeah, we have to rebuild every so many years.
Right.
We get trades, get good guys. They get pricey. We have our little window, and then they leave as free agents, or we trade them and do it again. So in that world, it makes sense. In the football world, if you don't feel you can bring the guys in, you're just basically condemning yourself and saying we are unable to manage the cap. We don't focus on the right things. So what's the point of saying we want to bring in guys and yeah, that helps them. We see these people winning doing this, but we don't think we can do that. That just says you are just not managing things right, because you should be able to do that. It's kind of like two people who make the same salary and say they have the same expenses. One of them has a bunch of money in the bank and the other one has, living paycheck to paycheck and in debt. You can decide how you want to spend your money. I mean, if you go out to eat, Wendy's every day at lunch, and you buy pricey this and pricey that and the big, whatever cable package, and the other guy's like, saving his money and not spending. So at the end of the month, when they want to buy something, the one guy can buy it and the other guy can't. It's not that, the system's out to get the guy that doesn't have the money. It's just, how did they spend that capital? And yeah, that's kind of like the previous comment. It's very frustrating because he's basically complaining about a situation that is self-imposed.
Right. And I mean, you just read this quote. He gets defensive, and we can't always. Our goal was to retain. We try to spend money. We try to spend our cap money in ways we think make sense. Our goal is to retain our own good players if we can. That's the first order of business, and we can't always do that with the cap room that we have. Tell me how you couldn't have kept Andrew Whitworth last year. Tell me how you couldn't have kept at least Mohamed Sanu or Marvin Jones the year before with the room that you end up having. I don't understand that. We do a lot of it that is quickly overlooked whenever we do it. He's playing the martyr right there. We do a lot of it, meaning retaining their own players, and it's quickly overlooked. I'm assuming he means by the public whenever we do it. Oh, go do this, go do that. Well, the chips to do that have been spent. They're gone. It's not accurate. And if you read Bengals.com, which I think almost every single Bengals fan does, and God bless Jeff Hobson, he's got a tough job to spin a lot of positives for the Bengals, even in tough seasons, and he kind of has to be a little bit of a middleman voice between the organization and to the fans, getting news out there and everything. And God bless him, he has to talk about every year this rookie pool allocation in terms of salaries and all of that goes to draft picks. I have never, ever, and now granted, I don't go to every team's site all the time or anything like that, but I never hear other teams' owners, other teams' sites talk about a rookie pool as to a reason why they're not active in free agency. The Bengals are the only team I ever hear that uses that excuse in terms of not being able to sign their own guys, in terms of not being able to be active in outside free agency. I don't get it. It's an excuse they use. Mike Brown, again, I think, again, not to totally be negative on this show, and because if we really went through that entire interview, it'd be a very negative show. But I think, unfortunately, there's a lot of the same that's going on with the Bengals organization. There's a lot of the same with, how the owner perceives is the best way to run the franchise, even though he has a guy that we think maybe has his ear in Marvin Lewis, maybe wrestled away some control. This interview, maybe he's just kind of playing things close to the vest, but I'm not seeing a lot of differences in terms of what Mike Brown is saying, based especially in keeping a lot of the same coaching staff intact. And there doesn't seem to be a lot of wholesale changes that we kind of thought might be coming this offseason, but we'll see. There's still, some months ahead, and we'll see. Any other additional thoughts before we wrap this segment up, Scott?
Yeah, one last point. There was something you mentioned, and Michael, I have to say something about this. When Mike Brown made the comment, about how they're signing their own guys and they don't have the money available to sign their players, bring in the outside free agents. Well, in theory, you had $15 million last year that you spent on Dre Kirkpatrick and Adam Jones. Dre Kirkpatrick really has never seemed to prove to be worth, the big contract he got. And then Adam Jones is a guy that you probably could have cut, should have cut, around Christmas time last year when he was arrested by Cincinnati police and got belligerent, I guess, was cussing at him and spitting on him and all the stuff that happened. Maybe Christmas year, like 13 months ago, Christmas, not last year. So in theory, you want to free up that money to keep Andrew Whitworth or, bring in a center or, I don't know, someone who can block. You had the money there. And, even if you let Kirkpatrick go, you still have William Jackson, you have Denard, you have Josh Shaw, Kavari Russell. You had some people. You may not have been as high on them as Denard, but if Denard's going to cost you $8, $9, $10 million, okay, it's not like you don't have bodies out there you can put in that spot, because you have, a bigger pressing need at left tackle, right tackle, center, those 5 offensive line positions. Well, I guess 4 of them if you don't include Bodine, or Bowling, who's been pretty decent. So to your point, you had the money. You just chose not to spend it wisely. And that is unfortunately something the Bengals have done when they keep their own. You look at some of the near misses they had when they tried to keep Michael Johnson 7 years ago, and he decided not to sign with them. He ended up going to Tampa Bay the next year, and the Bengals gave the money to Dunlap. Turned out to be a great in hindsight, is like, wow, look at this. They got Dunlap locked up long term. Johnson goes for a year. He comes back. They have him. What most people don't realize is they almost missed out on Dunlap and gave all that money to Johnson. Same thing happened with there's a couple of examples. I think Marvin Jones is another one, but they tried to way overpay him at first. And he just like, no, I want to be a number one guy. And he's a good guy. I don't think his value was worth what they initially tried to pay him. And there's been some other examples. I think there was a safety and another player where they threw a big chunk of money at them. The player turned it down, left in free agency. It turned out to be, a very fortunate thing for the Bengals. And sometimes it bites them because the player takes the money. But when you're doing that, you are missing out on being able to spend that money on a better outside player. So again, he's just doing a good job of, he's kind of saying without saying that he's running the team poorly and and using the results as an excuse, but doesn't really seem to be owning up to the fact that those results are because of things he's doing.
Yeah, and I love the example you made of Adam Jones, Dre Kirkpatrick versus Kevin Zeitler and Andrew Whitworth. I understand. I can get behind the idea. And again, this was another conversation I had with a friend of mine last night about Pro Football Focus and how Pro Football Focus also agrees that teams should not use high draft collateral, maybe even high free agency collateral to sign offensive guards because their impact on games is not as high as other positions that are out there. So I can get behind a little bit the decision of not paying Kevin Zeitler $10, $11 million a year to stick in Cincinnati. I can understand that. But when you look at the decision to keep Adam Jones, a guy who has been when he wasn't already in trouble with the league and the law in the early parts of his career, he has had real close brushes with it. Like you mentioned last New Year's Eve, not New Year's Eve 2018, New Year's Eve or New Year's 2017. He had another incident where he punched a girl in the face at a bar. If you remember that one a few years back, there was an incident where he hurt his neck in some weird, I think it was like a boating thing or something. A few years back as well. Though he has basically avoided jail time, avoided certain major issues in Cincinnati that plagued him in the beginning of his career, he has had brushes with the law in Cincinnati. Let's not kind of sweep that under the rug. There have been issues with Adam Jones and the law. Now, has he been a decent player for the Bengals? Yes, he made a Pro Bowl as a return man, or an All-Pro berth, I think, as a return man. He made a Pro Bowl a couple of years ago. He's a talented guy, but when you look at, similar age in terms of Adam Jones and Andrew Whitworth, you look at the value of a player in terms of a locker room presence, in terms of position they play, in terms of what you have stacked and collected in terms of draft picks at that position. Yes, the Bengals drafted 2 tackles in 2015, thinking that would be the answer to Andre Smith and Andrew Whitworth's aging process and them leaving, retiring, whatever. But it's just that type of decision where you go, hey, I mean, I don't know if it really came down to this, but if you're saying, hey, if we have to pay Andrew Whitworth X amount of dollars and this cap space, or Adam Jones X amount of dollars and this cap space, to me, that's an absolute no-brainer. You keep Andrew Whitworth. Absolutely. And I was on another recent podcast with some old friends recently, and there is no excuse that Andrew Whitworth, I said this on that show too, there's no excuse that Andrew Whitworth should have gone anywhere else besides being in Cincinnati and retiring a Bengal. And even if you have to overpay a little bit, or what you deem as overpaying for his services, there is absolutely no reason that he should have been anywhere else besides Cincinnati, unless he totally wanted out of Cincinnati, which he has never given that indication. I think that's a great point, Scott, that decision making. What do you make of Mike Brown's comments in recent interviews? You can get in touch with us on Twitter at BengalsOBI, or via email, theobinsider@gmail.com. You can also get in touch with the program and download the program on iTunes, SoundCloud, YouTube, and at CincyJungle We're kind of running up a little bit against some time, but I want to get to some other items here, Scott, one of which is something that Jeremy Hill tweeted out on Wednesday afternoon. It basically was a highlight video of his, and spoiler alert, most of the positive highlights came from 2014. It's a highlight video of his, and I believe, let me pull up the tweet to give you the exact words, but it was basically something that showed that he was not coming back to Cincinnati. He actually wrote, "Been one hell of a ride, Cincinnati, on to the next chapter." To me, and to anybody that has any kind of common sense, that sounds like Jeremy Hill is setting himself up for not being back with the Bengals in 2018. Not so much a surprise given his declining play and his declining touches in recent years. He spent 4 years here in Cincinnati and looks as if it's time that he's moving on. The Bengals are moving on now that they have Joe Mixon, Giovanni Bernard is signed long-term. I guess I want to ask you this question, Scott. Was Jeremy Hill a product of, was his play a product of the fact that the Bengals, especially this last year, lost Andrew Whitworth, lost Kevin Zeitler, and relied on certain players that were not very good on the offensive line? And really, since he came in the league, Russell Bodine, a center who has struggled as well. And was he, there's been some offensive coordinator turnover as well. There was Hugh Jackson, and obviously in 2014, the Bengals kind of heavily relied on Jeremy Hill in the run, especially late in the year with so many injuries. And then, as 15, 16, 17 progressed, they kind of changed the offense a little bit. Or was he a guy who, after a terrible 2015 follow-up season with fumbles and terrible yards per carry, obviously the big fumble against Pittsburgh, I mean, did stuff kind of get in his own head, and I guess it comes down to, was 2014 an anomaly, or was it that's who he truly is and the Bengals let him down?
I think I was kind of thinking about Jeremy Hill, and one guy that he reminds me of as far as Bengals history, kind of looking back over the last couple decades, is someone like a Rudy Johnson. Rudy Johnson obviously had a stretch of better seasons, but he had a much better offensive line. You look at how they play; they're both 2-down backs, big bruisers, big guys, first, second down. They're very similar in that neither one can really create much on their own. They need they need a running lane, solid blocking, someone that you let them get up to speed. You give them some sort of crease where they don't have to do a lot on their own. They don't have to use a lot of, vision. They don't have to sidestep a lot of guys in the backfield. You just give them a hole and tell them to go. If you can tell, Rudy Johnson or Jeremy Hill to do that. Jeremy Hill showed in that rookie year for that, 8-game stretch. He was very good at that. You give him some solid blocking, with some of the guys they had on that line blocking for him. And just like with Rudy Johnson, those years, he was really ripping it. He had some of the Bengals' best offensive lines. He was really able to do some really good things. And, I think the problem with Jeremy Hill was that as time went on, that line just kind of did not have that same level of quality, and he wasn't getting the same number of touches because he just wasn't able to do it on his own. He's looking at someone like him and Joe Mixon, just totally different. Joe Mixon's a guy who's basically creating on his own. He can make people miss. He has more vision, elusiveness. Now, whether he's as good of a powerful runner or whatever, that's a different story. But, he's just a completely different animal. I think Jeremy Hill could probably still have success in this league, just not on a team like the Bengals. He needs a team like the 88 Bengals, where you have just insane blocking, guys like Munoz and Montoya and that. If you give him a line like that, I think Jeremy Hill could have a productive season. You give him a average to below average offensive line or the Bengals offensive line, he just showed he's a one-dimensional runner who needs a lot of help. And without that help, I think he's just going to struggle.
Yeah, and unfortunately, the Bengals changed up schemes a bit on him. I think there in 2014 the scheme was really built around him, and that's That's kind of when the fullback kind of came into prominence and all of that. So I think I think it's a little bit of both. I think the Bengals let him down in terms of the offensive line in front of him, some scheme alterations, but at some point you have Jeremy Hill, you have Giovanni Bernard, you have AJ Green, you had Marvin Jones, Mohamed Sanu, Tyler Eifert. There's only one football to go around. So you kind of have to kind of pick and say, are we really going to commit to the run? Are we going to commit to the pass? You can do a balanced attack, but, at times there are sacrifices to be made when you balance out your offense. Sometimes the passing game takes a little bit of a backseat. Sometimes the running game takes a little bit of a backseat. And, I think Jeremy Hill is a guy that has both been a victim and has been I don't mean this in the truest sense of the word, but a criminal because of fumbles, because of poor yards per carry, all of that. So, I do think Jeremy Hill is a little bit of both. I think, unfortunately, those fumbles early in 2015 got into his head. Unfortunately, that fumble, and unfortunately, even after that great rookie season he had with the Bengals, unfortunately, that fumble in 2015, that seems to be that run in 2014 seems to be overshadowed by the fumble that he had in the wild card game against Pittsburgh. Yeah. That just doesn't, unfortunately, that seems to be the major thing that most fans remember about Jeremy Hill's time in Cincinnati. It's just, and it's a shame. It's a bummer that's how it is. But, he hangs on to that football. Or, if you even rewatch that clip, it seems as if that there is a chance that could not have been a called a fumble, but whatever. It's 2 years ago now, 3 years ago now, I guess. You got to move on. But regardless, it is what it is. And Jeremy Hill appears to not be a Bengal this coming off season. It'll be interesting to see if he becomes productive elsewhere. And it'll also be interesting to see if the Bengals spend a decent pick or get someone in free agency to help boost that. What do you think about Jeremy Hill and his recent tweet kind of saying goodbye to the Bengals? What do you think of his career? What do you think of him in his 4 years with the Bengals? It's kind of a bittersweet thing that is going on with Jeremy Hill and his tenure with the Bengals. Nick Mark says, wish him the best, but I'll remember the attitude and dancing more than his play. Unfortunately, I think that's true. He also asked, there was always a reason, an excuse, an injury taking too much time. The fumble was a blow to his confidence. Totally agree. Hugh was his offensive coordinator 14-15. Christopher Higdon says, of course, that is true. And obviously 14 was his big banner year as a pro. So I don't exactly know what's ahead for Jeremy Hill. I don't exactly know where he's going to end up. I think, unfortunately, it's one of those situations where he's going to be elsewhere, and it's better off for both sides. I just, second round pick. I had high hopes for him, especially not only after he was drafted, but after that 14 season, never really fully materialized. So maybe in a different scheme, different coaching staff, there'll be some other things. You can get in touch with us about the Jeremy Hill situation and download the program on iTunes, SoundCloud, YouTube, and at cincyjungle.com. You can also get in touch with us at Bengals OBI on Twitter and the OB Insider at gmail.com via email. We look forward to hearing back from you. So I think we'll hold off on the ways to improve the Bengals in 2018. Another installment of that. We're running kind of a little short on time here, so I think we'll hold off on that for next episode and go to some listener questions. We received a lot via Twitter and some in the YouTube chat. I'm going to try and get to as many as possible here. Good friend Mike Donahue hit us up on Twitter, and I believe he's in the YouTube chat as well. And if you can, wish Mike a belated happy birthday. His birthday was recently, I believe. So Mike is a good friend of this show, of other shows I've been a part of, and of Cincy Jungle. Great guy. So happy belated birthday, Mike. I'm going to answer this one relatively quickly. What are your thoughts on bringing back Russell Bodine and Andre Smith, which I think we all know is going to happen? I do agree with the second part of that statement, with being that they're going to be cheap, they're going to be affordable, they're going to be guys that, especially Andre Smith, gives them flexibility. If you remember when they signed Andre Smith last free agency period, by the way, that was supposedly one of their big quote-unquote outside free agency signings, a guy who went away from the team for 1 year, was hurt the majority of that year, and then comes back to the Bengals. Now, I have to give Andre Smith credit. They were looking at him at right guard to be their starting right guard. That never happened. He was a backup for the first few games. Jake Fisher and Cedric Ogbuehi were massively struggling. Andre Smith came in and helped solidify the tackle position at least a little bit, especially during that time when they started winning some games against the Colts and other teams there, kind of put a Band-Aid over stuff. My thing is this. For Andre Smith, I think you can get him cheap. I think you can get him, and he's a good, viable backup / emergency starter guy. If you sign him, that's not a remedy of any kind for this line. In terms of starting players and all of that, there needs to be a massive overhaul, and or hopefully Frank Pollock, the new offensive line coach, can get more out of the guys that are already there. So I'm not opposed to bringing back Andre Smith. I don't think you hand him a starting position, and he's a guy who should be fighting, even though he was a former top, I think he was a number 6 overall pick. He's now at the tail end of his career, and even when he was in there for an extended period of time, I don't believe that he's still a viable long-term starting option at this point. Not, again, a guy that you can bring back probably relatively cheap, an incentive-laden deal, not a big deal. Obviously, Bodine is a completely different animal. In case you missed it, Marvin Lewis publicly came out recently and said, we're working hard, quote unquote, to re-sign Russell Bodine. I don't know how hard you have to work for a guy that probably isn't in that high of demand, but the Bengals seem to like him. And this, along with Andre Smith, totally reeks of a Mike Brown signing. We talked about Mike Brown earlier in the program. This totally reeks of that type of signing. And stay with the guy you know. Hope that he improves. Get a guy that is a starter that you can get that's affordable. This is a total Mike Brown move. And this builds on the lack of change that we kind of sensed from some of the quotes that Mike Brown put out there recently. So to me, there have been moments where Russell Bodine has played well. There have been moments, and in the last 2 games, the offensive line began to gel a little bit with some reshuffling and different guys in there, but Bodine has been a constant. I guess if you want to be positive, Bodine's been durable. He's been reliable in terms of starting for the team, being there, being available. He's just a lower tier center in the NFL in terms of a starter. And to me, this is a season where, and I probably said this last offseason as well, but this is a season, an offseason where the Bengals can ill afford to not review almost any starting position on this team. After 2 straight losing seasons to follow up 5 straight playoff berths, this is a team that needs to examine every starting position and see how it can improve. Whether it's the coaching staff, and maybe the coaching staff can get more out of certain position groups, very possible. Whether it's drafting new guys or whether it's in free agency and getting guys to come in and potentially usurp other starting positions from long tenured veterans, none of that should be off the table. And unfortunately, it just kind of seems like, well, we're trying to re-sign Russell Bodine, and he's going to be our starting center, and that's that. If that is that, okay, not ideal, but the Bengals better do a very good job of retooling the offensive line in 2018, whether that means Christian Westerman getting a shot at one of the guard positions, whether that means drafting a guard tackle or both in the draft, or a center in the draft, all of those. The Bengals need massive help up front, and that was very painfully evident in 2017. So to Mike Donahue, thank you for the question. I do believe both will be back. If Bodine is, but the other thing I want to say to this, aside from examining positions and who should be starting, who shouldn't be, the other thing I think that the Bengals need to really harp on, and spoiler alert, this was a little bit about what we were going to talk about with how to improve the Bengals in 2018, but competition. Yes, there are players that are going to continue to have their hold on the starting position. For better or for worse, Andy Dalton is one of them. AJ Green, obviously, no one's going to take that number one wide receiver mantle away from him. Geno Atkins, Carlos Dunlap, guys like that are not going to be replaced, and nor should they be in 2018. But there are a number of other positions that need to have competition be bred into them, and I think the center position is definitely one of them. If you re-sign Bodine, okay, but does that mean Christian Westerman's going to get a shot at center? Does that mean you're going to draft a center in the mid-rounds to potentially push Bodine and or push for a starting guard position? I think all of those options should be on the table. So I was a little disappointed, like many of you were, about the Bodine news, but it really shouldn't be all that shocking, unfortunately. Thanks for the question, Mike, and hope you're doing well, my friend. We had one from Sam Anger, the gentleman from across the pond. We have a Sam is a listener and a Cincy Jungle avid reader from the UK, and Sam, you interact with us a lot. Totally appreciate your support of the program. And he uses the word lads, which is obviously points to the United Kingdom heritage there. He writes, all right, lads, just intrigued to know your thoughts on us, the Bengals, playing the hybrid next year, which sounds like it will be happening. Meaning on defense, Terrell Austin there hasn't been an official, at least to my knowledge, there hasn't been an official, hey, we're going to be 3-4, we're going to be 4-3, we're going to be multiple. It sounds like what Terrell Austin said when he was hired is essentially, I'm not going to format my defense in a standard way, I guess, meaning the 3-4-4-3. I'm going to create a defensive system that works towards the strengths of the players that we have. Well, the strengths that the Bengals have, they can get to the passer, and they have great play oftentimes from their cornerbacks. And you can, some people are down on Drake Kirkpatrick, rightfully so, down on Adam Jones, rightfully so, but we saw some great things from William Jackson, some great things from Darqueze Dennard last year. We have seen great things in the past from Adam Jones and Drake Kirkpatrick. So they have talent on the edge there as well. That's kind of what Sam, I believe, is referring to in terms of what Terrell Austin said. Dunlap and Atkins playing end and Billings at nose. That would be the 3-4-ish type of look. Willis and Lawson playing 3-4 LB rotation could be awesome. Fun times may be ahead. Very true, Sam. I think you can do a lot of different things. What's good is the Bengals have players that you can do a lot of different things with. Dunlap is a guy you can get creative with. Obviously, you saw Michael Johnson be able to kick inside and do some things inside on passing downs last year. Billings is that big, stout nose tackle, as Sam mentioned. Carl Lawson is kind of a guy that I would think the Pittsburgh Steelers or the New England Patriots would froth at the mouth over because of his 3-4 ability, rush off the edge, that sort of thing. Now, the Bengals didn't play him in space, and I think that was a good thing in 2017 because as a rookie, you kind of want a guy who did one thing well in college and you want him to do the same thing well in the NFL. And kudos to the Bengals. They let Carl Lawson do what he did well in college, and it paid off to the point of 8.5 sacks on the year and multiple pressures, that sort of thing. So I think there's a lot to work with. In 3-4 looks, I'm really interested about Geno Atkins. Geno Atkins is more of that 4-3 type. It would be weird to me to see Geno Atkins play almost on the edge at times. I don't think that is going to work for him. I think because Atkins is a guy who's compact, he's stout, and he's very strong in terms of his core, in terms of his legs. And what he does, it's the same thing that Aaron Donald does. He sneaks up into these bigger guard centers, that sort of thing, and gets inside of them and uses his leverage, his low center of gravity to get past them. And I just don't know if that is something that will work off of the edge. I think length, I think speed, that sort of thing works better off of the edge than Atkins kind of, bull rush, get inside of an opponent's pads, shove them out of the way sort of thing. So I wonder about that. And I also think, to Sam's point, I think the Bengals need to heavily, heavily, heavily invest in the linebacker position this offseason, whether it's in the draft or free agency. I think, number one, that position has just been really over the past couple of years has been one that has been decimated by injury. Vontaze Burfict is one of the best linebackers in the league when he's healthy and or available. That is an inconsistent thing to rely on, unfortunately, with Burfict. And so, I think the Bengals need to have other linebackers they can rely on this year. I am excited, though, that there's going to be some varying looks, apparently, with Terrell Austin in the defense. I think that is something that's needed. I think against those better teams that have made those type of second half adjustments that the Bengals have not. I think that if the Bengals remain varied and can play well at doing so, I think that's going to go a long way in helping the defense out and helping the offense out. Getting the ball back to them, getting them good field position, that sort of thing. So great questions, Sam, another good friend of the program, at Samanger Sam, S-A-M, Sam Anger, I guess, Sam, I should say, on Twitter there if you want to give him a follow. Last question of the evening from AJ Mithen, again on Twitter. And unfortunately, this is a question that it can be answered pretty quickly, but I think it breeds other questions. AJ Mithen says, when was the last time a Bengals special teamer returned a kickoff or punt for a touchdown? Feels like maybe 5 or 10 years. The last one, I've been kind of trying to do a little bit of research while doing the program here. The last one I definitively remember was Brandon Tate's punt return touchdown against the Seahawks in 2011. The Bengals ended up winning that game, and they went 9-7, went to the playoffs. So that was one I remember. Now they've had other big returns. Alex Erickson had a couple last year in 2016 to help on kickoffs. I'm kind of looking at Adam Jones. He had one. Okay, so he had a punt return touchdown in 2012. So that then trumps Brandon Tate's return. So I think it's been since Adam Jones's punt return touchdown in 2012 is the most recent. Now, while the Bengals haven't had, the big touchdowns on special teams, what they have had, like I said, Adam Jones has had numerous big returns that have put them in insane field position. They've had other good returns from Alex Erickson on the kickoff return game. So, they've had some, it hasn't been a total, terrible type of situation in the return game. What I think this breeds, though, is again the question of who the Bengals put on special teams coverage or special teams returns, and their unwillingness to play a lot of youngsters in varying. And Nick Marks did say, by the way, in the YouTube chat, Nick Marks did say that Pac-Man had one this year, but got called back. True. This, to me, points to an unwillingness of the coaching staff to play young players and or get the players on the field who give you the best chance to make an electric play, get in the end zone, that sort of thing. You can look back to this year. Yeah, the Bengals had two capable return men in Alex Erickson and Adam Jones. But Joe Mixon and John Ross were guys that were absolutely electric with the football in their hands in the return game in college. Now, granted, it was more earlier in their collegiate careers, but these are guys that, their snaps are limited on offense, especially John Ross. I understand you don't want guys to get hurt on special teams and, that sort of thing. To me, that is a weak excuse. To me, you always get, and you never want guys to get hurt. That's not what I'm saying, but you always want your best players, your most electric players, to get the football in their hands. And if you can't get the football in their hands on offense, if those are where your biggest playmakers are, if you can't get the ball in their hands on offense, then and they have special teams ability. They've shown that in the past. Why not put them on special teams? I don't understand that. To me, John Ross is a perfect example of a guy that should or could have had some type of returns, and especially when this team was struggling, when they were losing games, they couldn't get the ball in the end zone on offense in the early games with Ken Zampese. Why not try just try something? Try it. And they're very stuck in their ways. I always use the Reggie Bush New Orleans Saints example as to a team that shows that, hey, we're not afraid of putting a high-profile player on a special teams role because that can absolutely change the course. The Pittsburgh Steelers put Antonio Brown on kick returns. You have to get the ball in your best player's hands. And, there could be frustrations. There could be a risk of injury, but there's also a major upside. And this is a team that the Bengals always play it safe, always play it conservative. That's why they kept Brandon Tate around for a long time. That's why they like Alex Erickson. He had an electric year, and I keep using the word electric. I can find a different adjective. But he had a great preseason in 2016 in terms of offense and special teams. But he is a pretty safe commodity on special teams in the regular season. That's kind of who he is. Adam Jones, yeah, the Bengals have used him a bit on special teams, but now you have William Jackson stepping up and potentially looking like a viable long-term starter. You have Darqueze Dennard doing the same. You re-signed Dre Kirkpatrick. Adam Jones is getting towards the end of his career.Maybe he falls down the cornerback pecking order in terms of playing time, but he is a guy you rely on a bit more in the return game. He's electric with the ball in his hands. So I wish this team would just do some of these little things differently. There was, Andrew Hawkins was a guy you could have toyed around with as well. The team looks at some guys in preseason. Gio Bernard was a guy who even returned kicks in college and did so at a high level. Tyler Boyd was another guy. So I just, again, this goes back to some of the other things I said. I don't think there needs to be many options off of the table in order for this team to try and get back to the postseason and through the postseason this year. And special teams is one of them. So I hope that answers your question, AJ, as well as asks and answers others that follow up to that. Thanks for all your questions tonight, guys. I'm sorry I couldn't get to all of them. There were more in the YouTube chat, and I appreciate that. Please keep those coming our way every episode. We're going to try, like I said, we're going to try and make this still continue. I mean, it's always going to be a weekly show during the season and training camp and all of that stuff. Always going to be a weekly show, but a couple dry spells in the NFL calendar. We may take a week or two off, but we'll keep in touch with you. Obviously there are a lot of busy times ahead for the Cincinnati Bengals and the rest of the NFL with free agency, the draft, that sort of thing. A lot of things coming up and a lot of decisions to be made for the Bengals coming up. Tyler Eifert, we talked about Jeremy Hill, that sort of thing. So a lot of stuff coming down the pike. Keep it here. Keep it on cincyjungle.com. The folks there kill it. There is never a dry spell of content there. Just keep it there. Mock drafts, analysis, commentary, all that stuff. A lot of good writers there that do a lot of good stuff. You can get in touch with this program via Twitter at BengalsOBI or theobinsider@gmail.com via email. You can also get the program on iTunes, SoundCloud, YouTube, and on cincyjungle.com. Thanks so much for tuning in, guys. I know this is a frustrating and a trying time to be a Bengals fan, but there are good times ahead. I think we are a bit knee-jerk reactionist at this point, and I think there's going to be some good stuff, hopefully, coming down the pike. And, we sit here all the time, and after a disappointing end to a season for the Bengals, January, February, we get frustrated. Then all of a sudden, especially around the draft, we start to get excited. If you remember last year, things were looking pretty bleak, and the Bengals had a pretty exciting draft class, a lot of whom ended up contributing for the team. So hopefully that's the case this year, and hopefully these second-year guys end up contributing again for the 2018 Bengals. I'm Anthony Cosenza for my co-host Scott Schultze. This has been the Orange and Black Insider Bengals podcast. Thanks so much for tuning in. Thanks so much for your questions. We'll see you next time.